Picture a glittering palace hall where a priceless royal medallion, key to the kingdom's secrets, vanishes during a grand ceremony. 4 suspects emerge: a loyal guard with hidden debts, an ambitious noblewoman craving power, a charming diplomat with sly motives, and a desperate servant drowning in fear. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster from St. Mary Mead, whose quiet observations unravel a web of lies. As whispers of betrayal echo through Eldridge Palace, she sets a cunning trap, revealing a thief driven not by greed, but by a heart's desperate plea. In a world of secrets, only one truth shines through. Will you uncover it? Chapter 1. The Ceremony Interrupted. The grand hall of Eldridge Palace gleamed with an almost unearthly splendor, its vast expanse a testament to centuries of royal grandeur. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, casting a warm, golden light that flickered over the polished marble floors and the heavy velvet drapes embroidered with the crest of King Alaric's line. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax candles and the faint perfume of roses arranged in towering silver vases. It was the evening of the annual commemoration of the king's coronation, a ritual as old as the monarchy itself, where the elite of the realm gathered to pay homage to tradition. Tonight, the centerpiece of the ceremony was the royal medallion, a relic of gold and emeralds, its intricate engravings whispering of ancient kings and unbroken lineage. It rested on a velvet cushion atop a carved mahogany pedestal, catching the light in a way that seemed to command the room's attention. Miss Jane Marple sat in a cushioned chair near the edge of the hall, her small, unassuming figure half hidden by the shadow of a gilded column. Her invitation had come through her nephew, Raymond West, who had insisted the palace's history would enliven her spirits. Miss Marple had smiled at his enthusiasm, her pale blue eyes crinkling with affection. But it was not the tapestries or the portraits that held her interest. It was the people, their gestures, their glances, the subtle currents of motive and mood that flowed beneath their polished exteriors. Her hands, delicate but steady, worked a pair of knitting needles, the soft click of the ivory blending with the hum of conversation. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, perhaps a touch out of place among the glittering assembly. But her mind was as sharp as the needles in her lap, cataloging every detail with quiet precision. The hall buzzed with the low murmur of voices, punctuated by the clink of crystal goblets and the occasional ripple of laughter. Nobles in tailored silk and diplomats in starched collars mingled, their movements choreographed by years of courtly habit. At the center of the room stood Captain Roland Bryce, the guard tasked with watching the medallion. His ceremonial armor gleamed, though Miss Marple noted the faint tension in his broad shoulders, as if the weight of his duty pressed harder than the steel itself. His eyes, a steely gray, remained fixed on the medallion, though they flicked briefly to the crowd, betraying a vigilance that went beyond mere protocol. Nearby, Lady Eleanor Street Clare, a noblewoman whose beauty was matched only by her ambition, glided through the throng, her emerald gown catching the light in a way that rivaled the medallion itself. Her smile was practiced, but Miss Marple caught the sharpness in her gaze as it darted toward the king's dais, where His Majesty stood in quiet conversation with his advisors. Eleanor's fingers toyed with the sapphire pendant at her throat, a gesture that seemed less idle than calculated. A woman with plans, Miss Marple thought, recalling a certain Mrs. Eldridge from St. Mary Mead, whose ambitions had once upended a church fate with surprising ruthlessness. Across the room, Monsieur Henri Dubois, a French diplomat with a reputation for charm, leaned against a marble pillar, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. His tailored coat and meticulously knotted cravat spoke of wealth, but his manner suggested something more, a restless energy, perhaps, or a purpose not entirely aligned with the evening's festivities. He adjusted his cuffs with a flourish, a gesture that drew attention yet revealed nothing. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment as she considered him, reminded of a traveling salesman who had once passed through her village, all smiles and secrets. Her attention shifted to a young servant, Thomas Wren, weaving through the guests with a silver tray of wine. His movements were quick, almost too quick, and his face bore the strained look of someone carrying more than just a tray. His livery was impeccable, but his hands trembled slightly as he poured, and once, when a guest brushed past, he flinched as if expecting a blow. Miss Marple's lips pursed faintly. "A nervous boy," she mused, "and nervous for a reason, perhaps." The ceremony began with a flourish of trumpets, and the crowd fell silent as King Alaric ascended the dais. He was a man of middle years, his bearing regal, but his eyes weary, as if the crown weighed heavier than its gold. The medallion was to be the highlight of the evening, lifted by the king himself, in a gesture of continuity and strength. As he reached for it, his hand froze. The cushion was bare. A murmur rippled through the crowd, swelling into gasps of disbelief. The medallion, symbol of the realm's enduring legacy, was gone. The hall dissolved into chaos. Voices rose, some in outrage, others in fear. Sir Reginald Holt, the palace overseer, strode to the center, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Silence!" he barked, his voice cutting through the clamor. "No one leaves this hall until the thief is found." Guards moved to the doors, their boots echoing on the marble. Captain Bryce stood rigid, his face pale but composed, though Miss Marple noted the faint clench of his jaw. Lady Eleanor's hand stilled on her pendant, her eyes narrowing. Monsieur Dubois's smile faltered, replaced by a look of calculated surprise. Thomas Wren dropped his tray, the crash of crystal drawing every eye, his face ashen as he stammered an apology. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting undisturbed. "How very curious," she murmured to herself, her eyes bright with interest. The medallion was gone, but the truth, she knew, was still very much present, hidden in the glances and gestures of those around her. She settled in to watch, her needles clicking softly, like the ticking of a clock counting down to revelation. Chapter 2. The suspects emerge. The grand hall of Eldridge Palace, moments ago a stage for regal splendor, now hummed with a different energy, an undercurrent of suspicion that crackled like static before a storm. The chandeliers still cast their golden glow, but the light seemed harsher now, picking out the strained faces of the assembled guests. The royal medallion's disappearance had shattered the evening's decorum, and in its place rose a cacophony of whispers, accusations, and barely concealed panic. Guards stood sentinel at every exit, their polished armor glinting as they ensured no one left the hall. The air was thick with the scent of wax and wine, now tinged with the faint metallic tang of unease. Miss Jane Marple remained in her corner, her slight figure almost lost among the towering columns and the swirl of agitated nobility. Her knitting needles moved with their usual rhythm, the soft click-click a counterpoint to the rising din. To those who spared her a glance, She was merely an elderly spinster, a quaint addition to the guest list, her presence secured by her nephew, Raymond West's connections. But her pale blue eyes, sharp as cut glass, missed nothing. She watched the crowd with the quiet intensity of one accustomed to unraveling the secrets people carry in their gestures and glances. Her mind, as ever, drew parallels to her little village of St. Mary Mead, where human nature revealed itself in much the same way, whether clad in homespun or silk. Sir Reginald Holt, the palace overseer, took command with the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. His tall, angular frame cut through the crowd as he strode to the dais, his dark eyes sweeping the room like a hawk's. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, carrying the weight of his position. "This is an outrage," he declared, "a theft against the crown itself. The medallion will be found, and the culprit brought to justice. No one leaves until we have answers." His gaze lingered on Captain Roland Bryce, the guard who had stood watch over the medallion, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of Bryce's lips, a flicker of defiance or perhaps fear. The guests, corralled into groups by the guards, began to murmur their theories, their voices weaving a tapestry of blame. Lady Eleanor Street Clare, resplendent in her emerald gown, stood near a cluster of nobles, her posture regal, but her expression sharp. "It's obvious, isn't it?" she said, her voice carrying just far enough to draw attention. "Who else but the guard could have taken it? He was closest, after all." Her words were laced with a delicate venom, and Miss Marple observed the way her sapphire pendant gleamed as she tilted her head, as if to underscore her point. The accusation hung in the air, and Captain Bryce's face darkened, though he said nothing, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Monsieur Henri Dubois, the French diplomat, seized the moment to deflect suspicion. He stepped forward, his movements fluid, his smile a touch too polished. "Mon Dieu, Lady Eleanor, such haste to judge," he said, his accent lending a theatrical flourish to his words. "I saw that servant boy, Thomas was it, lingering near the pedestal earlier. Quite suspicious, none?" His dark eyes flicked toward Thomas Wren, who stood frozen near a side table, his tray of wine goblets trembling in his hands. The boy's face flushed scarlet, and he stammered, I was only serving drinks, sir. I never touched it." His voice cracked, drawing pity from some and skepticism from others. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly as she studied the exchange. Lady Eleanor's accusation had been swift, almost rehearsed, and Dubois' counter was equally calculated. Thomas's panic, however, seemed raw, unpolished, a reaction born of fear rather than artifice. She recalled a young shop assistant in St. Mary Mead, falsely accused of stealing from the till, whose trembling hands had betrayed not guilt, but terror of ruin. People point fingers to protect themselves, she thought, or to obscure something else entirely. Sir Reginald, his patience thinning, announced that each suspect would be questioned privately in the antechamber, a smaller room off the hall adorned with tapestries depicting the monarchy's triumphs. He invited Miss Marple to join as an observer, citing her reputation for discerning judgment in matters of human nature, a reputation that had reached even the palace, thanks to Raymond's boasts. She accepted with a modest nod, gathering her knitting and following Sir Reginald, her steps light but purposeful. The crowd parted for her, their eyes sliding over her as if she were no more significant than a shadow. She preferred it that way. The antechamber was a stark contrast to the hall, its walls lined with somber portraits and its air heavy with the scent of old wood and wax. A long oak table dominated the space, flanked by high-backed chairs that seemed to demand confession. Sir Reginald sat at the head, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the table, while a scribe stood ready to record every word. Miss Marple chose a chair near the corner, her knitting resuming as if she were merely passing the time. But her ears were attuned to every inflection, her eyes to every gesture. Captain Bryce was summoned first, his boots echoing on the stone floor as he entered. He stood tall, his ceremonial armor clanking faintly, but Miss Marple noted the slight sheen of sweat on his brow, a detail Sir Reginald overlooked. "Captain," Sir Reginald began, his tone clipped, "you were tasked with guarding the medallion. Explain how it vanished under your watch." Bryce's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "I stood by the pedestal all evening, sir. My eyes never left it. I saw nothing unusual, guests milling about, servants passing through. The medallion was there one moment, gone the next." His words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the faint hesitation when he mentioned the servants, as if he were weighing whether to say more. Sir Reginald pressed him. "You expect us to believe it disappeared by magic? You're a man of 20 years' service, Bryce. If not you, then who?" Bryce's eyes flickered, not to Sir Reginald, but to the floor, a brief lapse that Miss Marple filed away. "I don't know, sir," he said, "but I swear on my honor, it wasn't me." His voice held a note of pride, but also something else, strain, perhaps, or a secret held close. Miss Marple thought of a village constable who had once hidden his brother's petty theft to protect the family name. Honor, she mused, can be a heavy burden. Next came Lady Eleanor, her entrance as graceful as a dancer's, her gown whispering against the floor. She seated herself with the air of one granting an audience, her hands folded elegantly in her lap. "This is tiresome," she said before Sir Reginald could speak, her voice cool. "I was among the guests, as you well know, engaging in conversation. I had no reason to approach that pedestal, nor any interest in that relic." Her lips curved in a faint smile, but her eyes were hard, like chips of jade. Sir Reginald leaned forward. "You accused Captain Bryce. Why?" Eleanor's smile widened, but it did not reach her eyes. "Logic, Sir Reginald. He was closest, and I've heard whispers of his financial difficulties." She let the words hang, a delicate barb. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Eleanor's accusation was not impulsive. It was a blade, aimed with precision. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead widow, who had spread rumors about a rival to secure a seat on the parish council. Ambition, Miss Marple thought, makes one bold, but also careless. She noted the way Eleanor's fingers tightened briefly around her pendant when Bryce's name was mentioned, a gesture that spoke of control, or perhaps concealment. Monsieur Dubois followed, his charm undimmed despite the circumstances. He lounged in the chair, one leg crossed over the other, his smile disarming. "This is all a misunderstanding, surely," he said, his accent softening the edges of his words. "I am a guest, a diplomat, here to observe and pay respects. I was mingling, speaking with lords and ladies. Ask them." Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed. "And who, precisely, can vouch for your movements?" Dubois's smile faltered, just for a moment. "Well, I spoke with many, Lady Margaret, Lord Haverford. I cannot recall every name." His vagueness was a shield, and Miss Marple recognized it at once. She thought of a traveling musician who had once charmed her village while quietly pilfering from unattended purses. Charm, she reflected, is a mask, and masks slip. Thomas Wren was last, and his entrance was marked by a stumble, his tray clattering to the floor as he crossed the threshold. His livery was crumpled now, his face pale and damp with sweat. "I didn't do it," he blurted, before Sir Reginald could speak, his voice high and unsteady. "I was serving wine, that's all. I never went near the medallion." Sir Reginald's brow furrowed. "Yet you were seen near the pedestal, boy, and I've heard of your debts. A pawnbroker in the village, is it?" Thomas's eyes widened, and he shook his head frantically. "I owe money, yes, but I'd never steal. Please, sir, I swear." His voice broke, and he looked to Miss Marple as if her quiet presence might offer salvation. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was at work. Thomas's fear was genuine, but fear could spring from guilt as easily as innocence. She thought of a young gardener in St. Mary Mead, driven to theft by a loan he could not repay, his desperation written in every trembling gesture. Desperation, she mused, is a dangerous master. The interrogations concluded, Sir Reginald dismissed the suspects with a curt wave, declaring that the investigation would continue at dawn. The guests were to remain in the palace, confined to their quarters under guard. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag, and made her way to the hall, where the crowd had settled into uneasy clusters. She overheard snatches of conversation, speculation about Bryce's loyalty, Eleanor's motives, Dubois's foreign connections, and Thomas's debts. The air was thick with distrust, each glance a silent accusation. She found a quiet bench near a window, the night beyond a velvet curtain studded with stars. Her needles resumed their work, but her thoughts were elsewhere, sifting through the evening's revelations. Bryce's hesitation, Eleanor's calculated barb, Dubois's evasive charm, Thomas's raw panic. Each was a thread in a tapestry not yet complete. "It's always the small things," she thought. "The glance, the pause, the lie half told. They betray the heart's secrets." She recalled a case in her village, a stolen brooch that had set neighbor against neighbor. The thief had been a trusted maid. Her motive, not greed, but a desperate need to help a sick child. The memory stirred a flicker of sympathy for Thomas, but Miss Marple knew better than to let sentiment cloud her judgment. The truth, she reflected, is rarely kind, but it is always clear if one looks closely enough. As the palace settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the empty pedestal, its velvet cushion a mute witness to the crime. The medallion was gone, but the story of its theft was only beginning. She adjusted her shawl and returned to her knitting, content to wait. The guilty, she knew, would reveal themselves in time, as they always did. Chapter 3. The Guard's Tale. The antechamber of Eldridge Palace, with its somber tapestries and flickering oil lamps, felt like a confessional carved from stone. The air was cool, carrying the faint must of aged wood and the distant echo of the grand hall's fading clamor. Sir Reginald Holt sat at the head of the long oak table, his angular face set in a mask of impatience, his fingers steepled as if to anchor his authority. The scribe, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, scribbled notes in a ledger, his quill scratching like a beetle across the page. Miss Jane Marple occupied her usual corner, her knitting needles moving with a rhythm as steady as a metronome. To the casual eye, she was a mere spectator, her presence as unremarkable as the faded portraits on the walls, but her gaze, sharp and unobtrusive, missed nothing. Not the flicker of a suspect's eyelid, nor the subtle shift of a hand. Captain Roland Bryce entered with the measured tread of a soldier, his ceremonial armor clanking softly, a reminder of his duty and his disgrace. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, but there was a slight stoop to his posture, as if the weight of suspicion pressed harder than the steel plates. His gray eyes, usually steady, held a guarded intensity, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow, despite the room's chill. He stood before Sir Reginald, hands clasped behind his back, his stance rigid but not defiant. "Captain Bryce," Sir Reginald began, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "you were entrusted with the royal medallion. Its loss is a stain on your record. Explain yourself." Bryce's jaw tightened, but his voice was calm, almost mechanical. "I stood by the pedestal from the moment the ceremony began, sir. My duty was to guard the medallion, and I did not leave my post. Guests moved about, servants passed with trays, but I saw no one approach the pedestal directly. One moment the medallion was there, gleaming under the chandelier light. The next, it was gone." His words were precise, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting hesitation when he mentioned the servants, a pause so brief it might have gone unnoticed by a less attentive observer. She thought of a village blacksmith in St. Mary Mead, whose steady hands had faltered when questioned about a missing tool, his loyalty to a wayward son betraying him in that momentary lapse. Sir Reginald leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You expect me to believe it vanished under your nose? 20 years of service, Bryce, and not a blemish, until now. Are you suggesting some sleight of hand, or are you simply incompetent?" The accusation hung heavy, and Bryce's face flushed, though whether from anger or shame, Miss Marple could not yet tell. "I am neither, sir," he replied, his voice low but firm. "I swear on my honor I did not take it, nor did I see who did." His gaze dropped to the floor for a fraction of a second, a gesture that spoke of discomfort rather than deceit. Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind filing away the detail. "Honor," she mused, "is a shield, but it can also be a chain." Sir Reginald pressed further, his tone sharp. "There are rumors, Captain, whispers of debts, of late-night visits to a moneylender in the village. A man in need might see a golden medallion as a solution." Bryce's head snapped up, his eyes flashing. "Those are private matters, sir, and irrelevant. My debts, such as they are managed. I'd sooner die than betray the crown." His voice held a raw edge, and Miss Marple noted the way. His hands, still clasped behind him, clenched until the knuckles whitened. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead grocer, upright and proud, who had borrowed heavily to keep his shop afloat, his pride masking a desperation that led to petty theft. Debts, she thought, can bend even the strongest spine. Sir Reginald's lips curled in a faint sneer. "Managed, you say? We'll see. If you're innocent, who then? You were closest. Did you see nothing at all?" Bryce hesitated again, his eyes darting to the side, not toward Sir Reginald, but toward the tapestry behind him, as if seeking an answer in its woven threads. "The hall was crowded," he said slowly. "Lady Eleanor was near, speaking with Lord Haverford. The French gentleman Dubois lingered by the pillar, watching everyone. The servant boy, Thomas, passed by with his tray, several times in fact, but I saw no one touch the pedestal." His words were careful, but Miss Marple caught the emphasis on Thomas's name, a subtle shift that suggested more than he intended to reveal. Sir Reginald dismissed him with a curt nod, instructing him to remain in the palace under guard. Bryce saluted stiffly and left, his boots echoing in the silence. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady pace, but her mind was elsewhere, sifting through Bryce's testimony. His loyalty seemed genuine, his indignation heartfelt. But that hesitation, that glance to the side, it hinted at something unspoken. Was he protecting someone, or merely shielding himself? She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Farmer, who had lied to protect a friend, his loyalty admirable but misplaced. The truth, she reflected, often hides behind what is left unsaid. As Bryce's footsteps faded, Sir Reginald turned to the scribe, muttering about the guard's convenient ignorance. Miss Marple, unnoticed, allowed her thoughts to wander back to the grand hall. Bryce had been closest to the medallion, his duty binding him to its safety, yet it had vanished in an instant. The crowd, the movement, the distraction of the ceremony. It was a perfect stage for a thief. But was Bryce the actor, or merely part of the scenery? His mention of Thomas piqued her interest. Was it an honest observation or a deliberate deflection? And those debts, managed, he claimed, but the word carried a weight that suggested otherwise. She recalled the layout of the hall, the pedestal at its center, Bryce standing like a statue beside it, the guests swirling around like moths drawn to a flame. Lady Eleanor's sharp words, Dubois's calculated charm, Thomas's nervous flinch, each had played a part in the evening's drama. But Bryce's role was the most puzzling. His position made him the obvious suspect, yet his demeanor suggested a man burdened by duty, not guilt. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the possibility of a frame, a theft designed to cast blame on the most visible target. It's always the obvious that misleads, she thought, like a conjurer's trick, drawing the eye while the real work happens elsewhere. Sir Reginald's voice broke her reverie. "Miss Marple, your thoughts?" he asked, his tone grudging, as if he resented consulting an outsider, let alone an elderly woman. She smiled faintly, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that belied their sharpness. "Oh, I'm sure you have everything in hand, Sir Reginald," she said, her voice soft as a whisper of silk. "But Captain Bryce seems a man of principle, don't you think? His hesitation, though, it's curious. Perhaps he saw more than he's ready to say." Sir Reginald grunted, unconvinced, but Miss Marple's words planted a seed, one she knew would grow in time. As the antechamber emptied, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and made her way back to the hall, where the guests remained under guard, their whispers now hushed and wary. She settled into her corner, her needles resuming their work, but her mind was far from idle. Bryce's tale was only the first thread in a tapestry of secrets, and she knew the others, Lady Eleanor, Monsieur Dubois, Thomas Wren, would each add their own. People, she thought, are like books, full of stories they don't mean to tell. One only needs to read carefully. The night stretched on, the palace a gilded cage, and Miss Marple sat quietly, her eyes scanning the crowd. The medallion was gone, but its absence had revealed something far more revealing. The hidden currents of motive and fear that ran through every heart in the room. She would watch, and she would listen, and in time the truth would come to light, as it always did. Chapter 4. The Noble's Ambition. The antechamber of Eldridge Palace, with its heavy tapestries and flickering lamplight, seemed to close in as Lady Eleanor St. Clair entered, her emerald gown a vivid slash of color against the room's muted tones. Her steps were deliberate, each movement as calculated as a chess master's, her silk skirts whispering secrets only the stone floor could hear. The air carried the faint scent of polished oak and the lingering trace of her rose-water perfume, a fragrance that seemed to assert her presence before she spoke. Sir Reginald Holt, seated at the head of the long table, straightened, his stern gaze meeting her composed one. The scribe, quill poised, waited in silence, while Miss Jane Marple, tucked in her corner, knitted with a rhythm so steady it might have been mistaken for indifference. But her pale blue eyes, sharp as a winter morning, followed every nuance of Lady Eleanor's demeanor, noting the tilt of her chin, the poised fold of her hands, the sapphire pendant that gleamed like a third eye at her throat. "Lady Eleanor," Sir Reginald began, his voice a low growl of authority, "the royal medallion was stolen under our noses. You were in the hall, mingling among the guests. What did you see?" His tone carried an edge, as if he suspected her elegance masked something sharper. Eleanor's lips curved into a smile, delicate but unyielding, like porcelain. "I saw what everyone saw, Sir Reginald," she replied, her voice smooth as velvet. "A crowded hall, a distracted guard, and a medallion that vanished like a conjurer's trick. I was engaged in conversation with Lord Haverford and the Duchess of Wycliffe, discussing matters of court. I had no cause to approach the pedestal, nor any interest in that relic." Her words were precise, each syllable chosen with care, and Miss Marple noted the faint emphasis on relic, as if it were a trinket beneath her notice. Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed. "You were quick to point the finger at Captain Bryce. Why?" Eleanor's smile did not waver, but her fingers brushed the sapphire pendant, a gesture so fleeting it might have been accidental. "Logic, sir," she said. "He was closest, tasked with its safety. If the guard fails, who else is to blame?" Her tone was light, almost conversational. But Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of intent, like a blade wrapped in silk. Eleanor's accusation was not merely an observation, it was a move in a larger game. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead widow, Mrs. Claridge, who had once orchestrated a scandal to unseat a rival on the village council, her words as carefully aimed as arrows. "Ambition," Miss Marple mused, "is a restless thing, and it rarely moves alone." Sir Reginald leaned forward, his fingers tapping the table. "You dismiss the medallion as a relic, yet its theft threatens the crown's legitimacy. You're a woman of influence, Lady Eleanor, with ambitions at court. Some say you've clashed with the king's advisors. Could the medallion's loss serve your ends?" The question was blunt, and a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed Eleanor's face before her composure returned. "You overreach, Sir Reginald," she said coolly. "My ambitions are no secret. I seek to strengthen the court, not destabilize it. Stealing a bauble would hardly advance my cause." Her voice held a note of disdain, but Miss Marple noted the way her hand tightened briefly on the pendant, the sapphire catching the lamplight like a spark of defiance. The questioning continued, Sir Reginald probing her movements during the ceremony. Eleanor recounted her evening with the precision of a ledger. She had spoken with Lord Haverford about trade policies, exchanged pleasantries with the Duchess, and briefly greeted Monsieur Dubois, whose charm she described as excessive. She had noticed Thomas Wren, the servant, passing with his tray, but her tone dismissed him as beneath her concern. "Servants are always scurrying about," she said, "like mice in the walls." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind catching on the casual cruelty of the remark. It reminded her of a saint, Mary Mead lady, who had underestimated a housemaid's loyalty, only to find her secrets exposed in a most inconvenient way. Those who dismiss others, Miss Marple thought, often forget how much they see. Sir Reginald pressed her on Captain Bryce's alleged financial troubles, a rumor Eleanor had referenced in the hall. "I've heard whispers," she admitted, her voice low, as if sharing a confidence. "The village moneylender, a Mr. Grimsby, is said to have a hold over him, but I know little beyond that." Her eyes met Sir Reginald's, unblinking, and Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing, as if Eleanor were planting a seed without committing to its growth. The scribe scribbled furiously, and Sir Reginald's expression darkened, but he moved on, asking if she had seen anything unusual near the pedestal. "Nothing," Eleanor replied, "save the usual chaos of a crowded hall." Her answer was smooth, but Miss Marple's keen ear caught the faintest note of rehearsal, as if the words had been polished beforehand. As Eleanor rose to leave, her gown rustling like leaves in a breeze, Sir Reginald's voice stopped her. "One last thing, Lady Eleanor. Your influence at court. There are those who say you seek a higher position, perhaps even a seat on the council. A scandal like this could weaken the king's advisors. Could it not?" Eleanor turned, her smile sharp as a shard of glass. "You mistake me, Sir Reginald. I serve the crown, not my own vanity. If I sought power, I'd hardly resort to theft." With that, she swept from the room, leaving a trail of rosewater and unresolved questions. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady click, but her thoughts were racing. Eleanor's composure was a masterpiece, her every word a brushstroke in a carefully crafted portrait. Yet there were cracks. Her quick accusation of Bryce, her dismissive tone toward Thomas, her guarded response to questions of ambition. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead vicar's wife whose polished exterior had hidden a ruthless drive for influence, manipulating events to secure her husband's promotion. Power, Miss Marple reflected, is a motive as old as time, and Lady Eleanor wears it like her gown. Sir Reginald turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Well, Miss Marple, what do you make of her?" His tone was gruff, but there was a hint of curiosity, as if he sensed her insight went deeper than his own. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that belied their sharpness. "A most accomplished lady," she said softly. "She speaks with such confidence, doesn't she? But I wonder if she saw more than she claims. Her eyes, you see, they miss very little." Sir Reginald grunted, unconvinced, but Miss Marple's words lingered, a gentle nudge toward a truth he had yet to grasp. As the antechamber fell silent, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and returned to the grand hall, where the guests remained under guard, their murmurs now laced with fatigue. She found her bench near the window, the night beyond a canvas of stars, and settled in to observe. Eleanor had rejoined the crowd, her poise unshaken, engaging Lord Haverford in conversation with a smile that seemed to light the room. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the sapphire pendant, its gleam a constant in Eleanor's gestures, as if it were a talisman or a tell. Objects, she thought, can anchor a person or betray them. The hall was a stage, and Eleanor played her part with skill, but Miss Marple knew that even the finest performance left clues. The noblewoman's ambition was clear, but was it motive enough for theft, or merely a distraction from another's guilt. The medallion's absence was a puzzle, and Eleanor's testimony was but one piece. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving the threads of suspicion into a pattern that was slowly taking shape. "It's always the small things," she mused. "The glance, the gesture, the word not spoken. They tell the story, if one listens." Chapter 5. The Guest's Charm. The antechamber of Eldridge Palace, with its heavy air and shadowed corners, seemed to shift subtly as Monsieur Henri Dubois entered, his presence like a breeze stirring a still room. His tailored coat, cut in the latest Parisian fashion, hugged his lean frame, and his cravat, knotted with meticulous care, gleamed white against the lamplight. His dark eyes sparkled with a charm that felt both effortless and deliberate, and his smile, as he inclined his head to Sir Reginald Holt, was a study in disarming ease. The scent of his cologne, a faint blend of sandalwood and citrus, lingered as he took his seat, one leg crossed casually over the other. The scribe adjusted his spectacles, quill poised, while Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her corner, knitted with her usual quiet rhythm. Her pale blue eyes, sharp beneath their mild exterior, followed Dubois's every movement, noting the practiced grace of his gestures, the way his fingers brushed his cuff as if to draw attention to their elegance. Sir Reginald, his angular face set in a scowl, wasted no time. "Monsieur Dubois," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you are a guest in this palace, here by diplomatic courtesy. The royal medallion has been stolen, and you were in the hall when it vanished. What can you tell us?" Dubois's smile widened, his teeth flashing briefly as he leaned back, the picture of relaxed confidence. "Mon cher Sir Reginald," he replied, his French accent rolling smoothly over the words, "I am but an observer, invited to witness your splendid ceremony. I spent the evening mingling, exchanging pleasantries with your esteemed guests. I saw nothing of this theft, only the chaos that followed." His voice was light, almost musical, but Miss Marple caught the careful cadence, as if each word had been rehearsed in a mirror. Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed, his fingers drumming a slow beat on the oak table. "Mingling, you say? With whom, precisely? And where were you when the medallion disappeared?" Dubois' smile did not falter, but his gaze flicked briefly to the tapestry behind Sir Reginald, a fleeting distraction that Miss Marple noted. "Oh, with many," he said airily. "Lady Margaret, Lord Haverford, perhaps the charming Duchess of Wycliffe. I confess the names blur in such a dazzling crowd. As for my whereabouts, I was near the western pillar, enjoying a glass of your excellent claret." His vagueness was a shield, and Miss Marple thought of a saint. Mary Mead Charlatan, a self-styled investment advisor, who had beguiled the village with vague promises and a winning smile, only to vanish with their savings. "Charm," she mused, "is a currency, and some spend it too freely." Sir Reginald leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "You pointed to the servant, Thomas Wren, in the hall. Why?" Dubois raised an eyebrow, his expression one of mild surprise. "Did I? Merely an observation, sir. The boy was near the pedestal, scurrying about with his tray. He seemed nervous, non? One notices such things." His voice carried a hint of amusement, as if the accusation were a parlor game. Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind catching on the word nervous. Dubois's observation was precise, yet it felt like a deflection, a way to shift the spotlight. She recalled a traveling actor who had once passed through her village, his quick wit masking a penchant for pilfering from unattended coat pockets. Those who notice everything, she thought, often have something to hide. Sir Reginald pressed further, his patience thinning. You're a diplomat, Monsieur Dubois, with access to sensitive circles. Some might wonder if your presence here has motives beyond courtesy. The medallion is no mere trinket. It's a symbol of the crown's authority. Could its theft serve a foreign interest? The question was a barb, and Dubois' smile tightened, though his composure held. You flatter me, Sir Reginald, he said, his tone still light. I am a humble envoy, here to foster goodwill, not to meddle in your affairs. The medallion's value is clear, but I have no use for such symbols. My interests lie in diplomacy, not theft. His fingers brushed his cuff again, a gesture Miss Marple now recognized as a tic, a small crack in his polished facade. The interrogation continued, Sir Reginald probing Dubois' movements with increasing skepticism. Dubois recounted his evening with a flourish, describing conversations about art with Lady Margaret, a brief discussion of trade with Lord Haverford, and a passing compliment to the Duchess. Yet when pressed for specifics, who stood where, what was said, his answers grew slippery, like water through fingers. It was a lively crowd, he said, spreading his hands. One cannot track every moment. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over his evasiveness. It was not the outright lie of a guilty man, but the careful sidestep of one with something to conceal. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Guest, a man who claimed to be a scholar but whose questions about local estates had hinted at less academic pursuits. Curiosity, she reflected, can be innocent, or it can be a mask. Sir Reginald shifted tactics, his voice growing colder. You mentioned Thomas Wren's nervousness. Did you see him touch the pedestal, or anyone else? Dubois shook his head, his smile returning. Non, I saw no such thing. The boy was near, yes, but so were many. Captain Bryce stood like a statue. Lady Eleanor flitted about like a butterfly. Everyone was in motion. It was, how you say, a perfect moment for a thief. His words were casual, but Miss Marple caught the faint emphasis on everyone, as if he were spreading suspicion like a dealer shuffling cards. She noted, too, his glance toward the door, a brief flicker that suggested a desire to be elsewhere. As the questioning drew to a close, Sir Reginald's frustration was palpable. Your answers are thin, Monsieur Dubois. If you've nothing to hide, why so few specifics? Dubois' laugh was soft, almost musical. I am a diplomat, sir. Specifics are not my trade. I observe, I smile, I make friends. If I saw more, I would tell you. He rose, smoothing his coat, and inclined his head with a grace that bordered on mockery. I trust you will find your medallion. It is a pity to lose such a treasure. With that, he left, his cologne lingering like a signature. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady click, but her thoughts were far from idle. Dubois's charm was a weapon, wielded with the precision of a fencer, yet it was not impenetrable. His vagueness, his quick deflection to Thomas, his restless gestures, they suggested a man accustomed to navigating suspicion, perhaps even courting it. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Visitor, a journalist who had charmed the village while prying into private affairs, his questions always just shy of intrusive. Those who dazzle, she thought, often do so to blind. Sir Reginald turned to her, his brow furrowed. What do you make of him, Miss Marple? All charm and no substance. His tone was dismissive, but there was a hint of deference, as if he sensed her insight cut deeper than his own. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that masked their acuity. "A most engaging gentleman," she said softly. "He sees much, I think, but shares little. His interest in the servant boy is curious, don't you think? Almost as if he wished us to look there." Sir Reginald grunted, his skepticism clear. But Miss Marple's words planted a quiet seed, one she knew would take root in time. As the antechamber emptied, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and returned to the grand hall, where the guests remained under guard, their faces etched with fatigue and distrust. She found her bench near the window, the starlit night beyond a stark contrast to the tension within. Dubois had rejoined the crowd, his smile as bright as ever, engaging a young countess in conversation with a flourish of his hand. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered on his cuffs, the way they caught the light as he gestured, a reminder wasser. "Details," she mused, "are often the key to deception." Dubois's testimony was a performance, polished and elusive, but it had left clues. His quick accusation, his evasive answers, his restless glances. The medallion's theft was a puzzle, and Dubois was a piece that did not quite fit. Was he a thief, a spy, or merely a man too curious for his own good? Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving the threads of his words into the growing tapestry of the case. The truth, she thought, hides in the spaces between words, and Monsieur Dubois leaves many spaces. Chapter 6. The Servant's Burden. The antechamber of Eldridge Palace, with its somber tapestries and dim lamplight, seemed to grow heavier. As Thomas Wren shuffled through the door, his livery crumpled and his young face pale as moonlight. His hands, clutching an empty silver tray, trembled visibly, and his eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, darted from Sir Reginald Holt to the scribe, then to the floor, as if seeking refuge in its cold stone. The air carried the faint scent of wax from the lamps and the lingering trace of spilled wine, a reminder of Thomas's earlier mishap in the grand hall. Sir Reginald sat at the head of the oak table, his angular features set in a scowl, his fingers tapping an impatient rhythm that seemed to echo Thomas's racing pulse. The scribe adjusted his ledger, quill poised, while Miss Jane Marple, in her quiet corner, knitted with her usual unhurried precision. Her pale blue eyes, soft yet piercing, followed Thomas's every movement, noting the way his shoulders hunched, as if braced for a blow. "Thomas Wren," Sir Reginald began, his voice a low growl that filled the room. "You were in the hall during the ceremony, serving wine near the pedestal where the royal medallion was displayed. It's gone, and you were seen lingering nearby. What have you to say for yourself?" Thomas flinched, the tray slipping slightly in his grasp before he tightened his grip. I didn't take it, sir," he stammered, his voice high and cracking, like a boy caught in a lie. "I was just doing my duties, pouring wine, passing trays. I never touched the medallion, I swear." His words tumbled out in a rush, and Miss Marple noted the raw edge of panic, a sound she recognized from a St. Mary Mead lad who had once been accused of stealing apples, his fear born not of guilt, but of the terror of being misunderstood. Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed, his gaze pinning Thomas like a specimen. "Lingering, boy, Monsieur Dubois saw you near the pedestal, more than once, and there are whispers of debts, of dealings with a pawnbroker in the village. A desperate man might see a golden medallion as a way out." Thomas's face drained of what little color remained, and his tray clattered against his thigh. "It's true, sir. I owe money," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Grimsby, the pawnbroker, he's been pressing me. But I'd never steal, not from the king. I'm no thief." His eyes filled with tears, and he looked to Miss Marple as if her quiet presence might offer a lifeline. She met his gaze with a gentle nod, her expression serene, but her mind alert, sifting through his words for truth and omission. Sir Reginald leaned forward, his tone sharp as a blade. "Debts make men desperate, Wren. How much do you owe, and what did Grimsby demand?" Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. £100, sir," he said, his voice breaking. "My sister, she's sick, needs medicine. I borrowed to pay the apothecary, but the interest, it's crushing me. Grimsby said I had a month, or he'd take it to the magistrate." His hands shook so violently that the tray slipped, landing with a soft thud on the rug. He bent to retrieve it, his movements clumsy, and Miss Marple's heart stirred with pity, though her mind remained clear. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Gardner, young and earnest, who had pilfered from a church collection to save his mother's home, his desperation a mirror to Thomas's. Need, she thought, can drive a good heart to dark places. Sir Reginald's scowl deepened. £100 is a fortune for a servant, and you expect me to believe you didn't see the medallion as your salvation? You were near the pedestal. Dubois saw you, and Captain Bryce mentioned you passing by multiple times. Thomas shook his head frantically, his tears spilling now. "I was serving, sir. The hall was full, people everywhere. I passed the pedestal because it was in the middle of the room. I had to. But I never touched it, I swear on my sister's life." His voice cracked, and he clutched the tray like a shield, his knuckles white. Miss Marple noted the sincerity in his plea, but also the desperation, a quality that could cut both ways. Was it the cry of an innocent man, or the panic of one caught in his own web? Sir Reginald pressed on, relentless. "Describe your movements, boy, every step, every moment." Thomas's eyes widened, and he stammered through a recounting of his evening, fetching wine from the butler's pantry, circling the hall with his tray, offering goblets to guests near the dais, the pillar, the pedestal. "I saw Captain Bryce standing there, stiff as a statue," he said. "Lady Eleanor was talking to some lord, her green dress catching the light. That French gentleman, Monsieur Dubois, was by the pillar, watching everyone. I didn't stop. I didn't linger. I just kept moving." His voice rose, almost pleading, and Miss Marple's needles slowed as she listened. His account aligned with the others, yet it was the detail of Dubois watching everyone that caught her attention. It echoed her own observations, but Thomas's emphasis suggested he had felt the weight of that gaze. Sir Reginald's voice grew colder. "You admit to debts, to desperation. You were near the pedestal, and you expect us to believe you saw nothing, did nothing." Thomas's shoulders slumped, his voice barely audible. "I saw nothing, sir. I'm just a servant, trying to do my job. If I'd known anything, I'd tell you." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple again, a silent plea, and she offered a small, encouraging smile, though her mind was far from decided. Desperation could make a thief, but it could also make a victim. And Thomas's fear felt like a heavy cloak, one he might not have chosen to wear. The questioning ended, and Sir Reginald dismissed Thomas with a curt wave, instructing him to remain under guard with the others. The boy shuffled out, his tray clutched tightly, his footsteps uneven. The scribe scribbled the last of his notes, and Sir Reginald muttered under his breath about sniveling boys and their excuses. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm, but her thoughts were a whirl of connections and questions. Thomas's story was one of hardship, not cunning, yet his proximity to the pedestal and his debts made him an easy target. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Maid, accused of stealing a silver spoon, whose tears had masked no guilt, but rather the fear of losing her place. The vulnerable, Miss Marple reflected, are often the first to be blamed. Sir Reginald turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What do you make of the boy, Miss Marple? All tears and trembling, guilt or just cowardice?" His tone was gruff, but there was a hint of respect, as if he valued her quiet insight. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that softened her words. "He's frightened, Sir Reginald, and with good reason," she said softly. "Debts are a heavy burden for one so young, but fear can come from innocence as much as guilt. His story holds together, don't you think? Though I wonder why he noticed Monsieur Dubois watching so closely." Sir Reginald grunted, his skepticism clear, but Miss Marple's words lingered, a gentle nudge toward a truth he had yet to see. As the antechamber fell silent, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and returned to the grand hall, where the guests remained confined, their faces etched with weariness and suspicion. She found her bench near the window, the night sky beyond a tapestry of stars, and settled in to observe. Thomas had retreated to a corner, his tray set aside, his head bowed as if in prayer. The other suspects, Captain Bryce, Lady Eleanor, Monsieur Dubois, moved among the crowd, each playing their part in the uneasy drama. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Thomas, his youth and fear a stark contrast to the polished confidence of the others. A boy in trouble, she thought, is a story as old as time. But is he the thief, or merely the scapegoat? The medallion's theft was a puzzle, and Thomas's testimony was a piece that fit uneasily, its edges frayed by desperation. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving the threads of his story into the growing pattern of the case. "The truth," she mused, "is often buried under fear, but it always finds a way to the surface, if one is patient." She settled back, her eyes scanning the hall, content to watch and wait for the next clue to emerge. Chapter 7. The Palace's Secrets. The grand hall of Eldridge Palace, though still aglow with chandelier light, had taken on a strained air, as if the very walls held their breath. The guests, confined under the watchful eyes of the guards, whispered in hushed clusters, their earlier elegance fraying into fatigue and suspicion. The velvet drapes seemed heavier, the marble floor colder, and the absence of the royal medallion loomed like a specter over the gathering. Miss Jane Marple, her slight figure half hidden by a column, sat with her knitting. The soft click of her needles, a quiet anchor amidst the tension. Her pale blue eyes, keen beneath their mild surface, roamed the room, catching the flicker of a glance, the tightening of a jaw, the restless shift of a hand. She had excused herself from the antechamber's interrogations, citing a need for air, but her true purpose was to listen where tongues were looser, among the servants and the shadows. Miss Marple understood that palaces, like villages, thrived on secrets, and secrets were most often spilled in unguarded moments. She moved quietly through the corridors branching off the hall, her steps light, her shawl draped modestly over her shoulders. To the bustling maids and footmen, she was merely an elderly guest, perhaps lost in the maze of the palace, and her gentle smile disarmed their caution. She paused near a tapestry, depicting a hunt, its threads vibrant with stags and hounds, and struck up a conversation with a young maid, Nellie, who was polishing a silver candelabrum with nervous vigor. "Oh, miss, it's a terrible night," Nellie said, her hands trembling as she worked. "That medallion gone, it's like stealing the king's own heart." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her needles clicking as she asked in her softest tone if the palace had seen such troubles before. Nellie, eager for a listener, lowered her voice. "Not like this, miss, but there's always whispers. Captain Bryce now, he's a good man, but I heard he was seen arguing with that moneylender, Mr. Grimsby, down in the village a fortnight ago. Something about unpaid notes. It's not my place to say, but it's odd, ain't it?" Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with interest, though her expression remained placid. "How very distressing for him," she murmured, filing away the detail. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, shopkeeper, whose heated exchange with a creditor had led to whispered rumors, and eventually a confession of petty theft. Nellie, warming to her audience, continued. "And Lady Eleanor, she's always about, meeting with those lords who don't much like the king's advisers. I saw her myself, slipping into the West Wing last month, late at night, with a man in a dark cloak. Couldn't see his face, but they was whispering fierce." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, her mind turning over this new thread. Eleanor's ambition had been clear in her testimony, but clandestine meetings suggested a deeper game. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead widow, who had orchestrated secret gatherings to sway the parish council, her charm masking a ruthless strategy. Ambition, Miss Marple thought, thrives in shadows. Thanking Nellie with a gentle smile, Miss Marple moved on, her steps carrying her toward the servants' passage near the kitchen. There she encountered a footman, a wiry lad named Jem, who was stacking crates of wine with a scowl. Sensing his frustration, she remarked on the chaos of the evening, her tone one of shared concern. Jem, glad for a moment's pause, wiped his brow and muttered, "It's a right mess, ma'am. That Monsieur Dubois, he's a slick one. Kept asking me odd questions last week about the palace locks and when the guards change shifts. Said it was for his security report, but it felt queer." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained soft. "How curious," she said. "He must be very thorough." Jem shrugged, but his unease was clear, and Miss Marple tucked the information away, reminded of a St. Mary Mead visitor who had probed too deeply into local affairs, his curiosity a prelude to mischief. As she wandered further, she overheard two kitchen maids gossiping near a pantry door. One mentioned Thomas Wren, her voice low but urgent. "Poor Tom's in a state," she said. "I saw him last night sneaking out to the village after his shift. Met some man by the old oak, looked like Grimsby, the pawnbroker. Tom came back, shaking, said he was in deep." The other maid clucked her tongue. "He's a good lad, but those debts'll ruin him." Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind racing. Thomas's desperation was no surprise, but this late-night meeting added a new layer. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead boy, caught stealing to settle a loan, his fear of a ruthless creditor driving him to folly. "Desperation," she mused, "is a cruel master, and pawnbrokers are rarely kind." Returning to the grand hall, Miss Marple settled back on her bench, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The crowd had thinned slightly, some guests escorted to their quarters under guard, but the suspects remained, their presence like notes in a discordant melody. Captain Bryce stood near a window, his face etched with strain, his gaze fixed on the night beyond. Lady Eleanor moved among a knot of nobles, her laughter bright but her eyes darting, as if measuring every glance. Monsieur Dubois leaned against a pillar, his smile as polished as ever, though Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tapped restlessly against his thigh. Thomas Wren, relegated to a corner, polished a tray with mechanical motions, his face pale and drawn. The snippets of gossip she had gathered were like pieces of a quilt, each patch revealing a fragment of the palace's hidden life. Bryce's argument with the moneylender suggested financial strain, though his loyalty seemed steadfast. Eleanor's secret meetings hinted at a political agenda, her ambition a potential motive. Dubois' questions about security raised the specter of espionage, his charm a possible veil for darker intent. And Thomas, poor Thomas, with his debts and clandestine rendezvous, was a figure of pathos, but also of suspicion. Miss Marple's mind wove these threads together, her thoughts drifting to St. Mary Mead, where secrets had a way of surfacing in the most ordinary places, a tea shop, a garden gate, a whispered word. She recalled a case in her village, a stolen silver teapot that had set tongues wagging. The thief had been a trusted housekeeper, her motive not greed, but a need to protect a wayward son from a creditor's wrath. The parallel to Thomas was striking, yet Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. Secrets, she thought, are like roots, hidden, but they feed the truth. Each suspect carried their own burden, their own reasons to act or to deflect, and the medallion's theft was merely the spark that had illuminated their shadows. Sir Reginald emerged from the antechamber, his face a mask of frustration, and caught sight of Miss Marple on her bench. He approached, his steps heavy, and lowered his voice. "You've been wandering, Miss Marple. Any observations to share?" His tone was gruff, but there was a flicker of respect, as if he sensed her quiet probing, had uncovered more than his interrogations. She smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Oh, only that palaces are much like villages, Sir Reginald," she said softly. "People talk, and in their talk there's truth. I wonder, though, have you looked into the village pawnbroker? Mr. Grimsby? He seems to know more than most." Sir Reginald's brow furrowed, but he nodded, her words planting a seed he could not ignore. As he moved off to confer with a guard, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the hall, her needles clicking like a metronome. The palace was a labyrinth of motives, each suspect a thread in a tangled web. Bryce's debts, Eleanor's meetings, Dubois' questions, Thomas's desperation. They were all pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape. "It's like a quilt," she thought, "each patch different, but together they tell a story." She settled back, her eyes scanning the crowd, content to let the secrets unfold in their own time, as they always did. Chapter 8. The Medallion's Value. The morning light filtered through the high windows of Eldridge Palace, casting long, pale beams across the grand hall, where the air still hummed with the residue of last night's chaos. The chandeliers, now dimmed, hung like silent sentinels, and the velvet drapes seemed to sag under the weight of the unresolved theft. The guests, though permitted to retire to their quarters under guard, had returned to the hall for a subdued breakfast, their murmurs low and wary. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small table near a window, her knitting resting in her lap, her teacup untouched as she observed the room. Her pale blue eyes, sharp beneath their gentle surface, traced the movements of the suspects. Captain Bryce, rigid at his post, Lady Eleanor, poised among a cluster of nobles, Monsieur Dubois, charming a young countess, and Thomas Wren, hovering near the servants' entrance, his face drawn with worry. The absence of the royal medallion was a palpable void, its empty pedestal a mute accusation at the hall's center. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the medallion itself, its significance beyond the gleam of gold and emeralds. She had learned, in her quiet way, that objects of such import often held secrets deeper than their surface suggested. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen locket had once unraveled a tale of betrayal. Here, the medallion's theft promised a story no less complex. Determined to understand its true value, she sought out Dr. Mortimer, the palace historian, whose knowledge of royal relics was unmatched. She found him in a quiet library off the main corridor, a room lined with leather-bound tomes and lit by a single arched window. Dr. Mortimer, a stooped man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a beard like frost, looked up from a parchment as she entered, his expression one of mild surprise. "Good morning, Doctor Mortimer," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as a breeze, her smile disarming. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I've a great curiosity about the royal medallion. Might you spare a moment to enlighten an old woman?" Dr. Mortimer's eyes twinkled, charmed by her modesty, and he gestured to a chair. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "The medallion is no mere ornament. It's a relic of the first king, Alaric I, forged to mark the unification of the realm. Its gold was mined from the sacred hills, its emeralds chosen for their clarity, symbolizing truth and endurance." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she listened. "A beautiful symbol," she said, "but I've heard it holds a more practical purpose?" Dr. Mortimer's brow furrowed, but her gentle demeanor encouraged candor. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Indeed, the medallion is a key, quite literally. Its engravings align with a lock in the royal crypt, where treasures and documents of the monarchy's founding are kept. Without it, the crypt cannot be opened, save by force, which would be sacrilege. Its loss could cast doubt on the crown's legitimacy, especially in times of unrest." His words carried a weight that matched the palace's heavy air, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over this revelation. A key, she thought, changes everything. Motives shift when power, not wealth, is at stake. She thanked Dr. Mortimer, her smile warm, and returned to the hall, her thoughts a whirl of new possibilities. The medallion's role as a key suggested motives beyond greed, political intrigue, perhaps, or a bid to destabilize the monarchy. She considered each suspect in turn. Captain Bryce's debts, whispered about by the maid Nellie, pointed to a financial motive, but his loyalty to the crown seemed unwavering, his hesitation during questioning more protective than guilty. Lady Eleanor's ambition, hinted at in her clandestine meetings, could align with a desire to weaken the king's advisers. But would she risk such a brazen act? Monsieur Dubois's questions about palace security, as reported by the footman Jem, suggested espionage, yet his charm seemed more suited to observation than action. And Thomas Wren, with his crushing debts to the pawnbroker Grimsby, was the most obvious candidate for a thief driven by desperation, yet his youth and fear suggested a lack of cunning. Miss Marple settled back on her bench, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm as she watched the hall. Bryce stood near the pedestal, his eyes fixed on the empty cushion, his posture rigid, but his fingers twitching, as if grappling with an unseen burden. Eleanor glided past, her emerald gown catching the light, her conversation with a lord laced with subtle barbs about the court's stagnation. Dubois, now sipping coffee, laughed with a guest, but his gaze darted to the guards at the door, a fleeting sign of unease. Thomas, polishing a goblet with mechanical precision, flinched when a guest brushed past his eyes, red-rimmed from sleeplessness. The medallion's value as a key reframed the theft, and Miss Marple's mind returned to St. Mary Mead, where a stolen church key had once revealed a plot to discredit a vicar. Objects of power, she mused, draw those who seek control, not just wealth. Bryce's financial strain might tempt him to pawn the medallion, but would he risk his honor for a temporary gain? Eleanor's political ambitions could make the crypt's secrets a prize, yet her calculated nature suggested a subtler approach. Dubois, with his foreign ties, might see the medallion as a bargaining chip in diplomatic games, but his vagueness hinted at caution, not boldness. Thomas, desperate and vulnerable, was the likeliest to act impulsively, yet his fear seemed to outweigh his guile. She recalled the snippets of gossip from the servants, Bryce's argument with Grimsby, Eleanor's secret meetings, Dubois's probing questions, Thomas's late-night rendezvous. Each was a thread in a tapestry, and the medallion's role as a key added a new pattern. It's like a quilt, she thought, where every stitch matters, but the design only emerges with time. She considered the possibility of a conspiracy. Perhaps one suspect had acted while another distracted, or even a hidden player, unseen in the hall's chaos. The thought lingered, but she set it aside, knowing speculation without evidence was a trap. Sir Reginald approached, his face etched with frustration, and paused by her bench. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "you've been quiet today. Any thoughts on this mess?" His tone held a grudging respect, as if he sensed her insight outstripped his own. She smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Oh, I'm just an old woman, Sir Reginald, piecing things together," she said softly. "But the medallion's importance, it's more than gold, isn't it? I wonder if we're looking at the right motives." His brow furrowed, but he nodded, her words a spark in his weary mind. As he moved off, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the hall, her needles clicking like a metronome. The medallion's theft was no simple crime. It was a strike at the heart of the monarchy, and each suspect carried a motive that intertwined with the others. Bryce's loyalty, Eleanor's ambition, Dubois's curiosity, Thomas's desperation, they were all pieces of a puzzle, and the crypt's secrets were the frame. The truth, she thought, lies in what the medallion unlocks, not just in who took it. She settled back, her eyes scanning the crowd, patient as ever, knowing the next clue would come, as it always did. Chapter 9. A Quiet Observation. The grand hall of Eldridge Palace, though still draped in the opulence of velvet and gold, had settled into a tense hush as the day wore on. The morning's subdued breakfast had given way to an afternoon of restless waiting, the guests confined under the watchful eyes of the guards, their movements constrained like actors on a stage too small for their roles. The chandeliers cast a softer light now, the sun's rays filtering through high windows, but the air was heavy with unspoken accusations. The empty pedestal, where the royal medallion once gleamed, stood as a silent witness, its velvet cushion a stark reminder of the crime that held them all captive. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her familiar bench near a window, her knitting a cascade of soft clicks, observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity. Her pale blue eyes, sharp beneath their gentle veil, missed nothing: the flicker of a glance, the tightening of a lip, the subtle shift of a hand that betrayed more than words could. The hall was a tapestry of human nature, and Miss Marple, with her years of watching St. Mary Mead's villagers, knew how to read its threads. She had chosen her vantage point carefully, close enough to overhear snippets of conversation, yet distant enough to remain unnoticed, her elderly demeanor a cloak of invisibility. Her needles moved steadily, knitting a scarf that grew with each passing hour, but her mind was elsewhere, weaving the clues she had gathered into a pattern that was beginning to take shape. The medallion's role as a key to the royal crypt, as Dr. Mortimer had revealed, had shifted her perspective, suggesting motives rooted in power rather than mere greed. Yet the suspects, Captain Bryce, Lady Eleanor, Monsieur Dubois, and Thomas Wren, each carried their own burdens, their actions in the hall offering glimpses into their hearts. Captain Bryce stood near the pedestal, his ceremonial armor replaced by a simpler uniform, but his posture remained rigid, as if duty were a chain he could not shed. His gray eyes, usually so steady, flicked toward the king's dais, where his majesty conferred with advisors, their faces grim. Miss Marple noted the way Bryce's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, not in threat, but in a gesture of restraint, as if anchoring himself against some inner turmoil. She recalled the maid Nellie's gossip about his argument with the pawnbroker Grimsby, and his hesitation during questioning, a pause that suggested he knew more than he had shared. Loyalty, she thought, can bind a man to silence as much as to duty. Lady Eleanor Street. Claire moved among a knot of nobles near the dais, her emerald gown a vivid contrast to their muted silks. Her laughter was bright, her gestures graceful, but Miss Marple caught the sharpness in her gaze as she glanced at the empty pedestal, then at the king. The footman's whisper of her late-night meetings in the West Wing lingered in Miss Marple's mind, hinting at a woman whose ambitions reached beyond the court's polished surface. Eleanor paused to speak with a courtier, her voice low, her words laced with a subtle critique of the king's inflexible advisors. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead matron, whose charm had masked a campaign to unseat a rival, her every smile a step toward power. Ambition, she mused, is a fire that burns quietly until it flares. Monsieur Dubois, leaning against a pillar, sipped a glass of wine, his smile as polished as the crystal in his hand. He was deep in conversation with a young countess, his laughter drawing glances from nearby guests. But Miss Marple noted the way his eyes strayed to the hall's exits, a flicker of calculation in their depths. The footman. Jem's report of Dubois's questions about palace security echoed in her thoughts, suggesting a man whose charm was a tool, not an end. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead visitor, a journalist whose easy banter had hidden a knack for uncovering secrets, his curiosity a double-edged blade. Charm, she thought, is a mask, and masks are worn for a reason. Thomas Wren, relegated to the servants' corner, polished a silver tray with mechanical precision, his hands trembling slightly. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, and when a guest mentioned the pawnbroker Grimsby in passing, he flinched, nearly dropping the tray. The maid's gossip about his late-night meeting with Grimsby, weighed heavily in Miss Marple's mind, painting a picture of a boy crushed by debt and fear. She thought of a saint, merry Mead lad, driven to steal a neighbor's tools to settle a loan, his desperation a mirror to Thomas's. Fear, she reflected, can make a thief, but it can also make a pawn. As the afternoon deepened, Miss Marple's observations grew sharper, her mind sifting through the suspect's actions like a gardener sorting seeds. The hall was a stage, and each suspect played their part. But it was the small things, the glance, the flinch, the pause, that revealed their true roles. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead case, a stolen brooch that had unraveled a web of jealousy and deceit, the truth lying not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments no one thought to watch. It's always the small things, she thought, that betray the heart's secrets. A stir near the dais drew her attention. Sir Reginald Holt emerged, his face a mask of controlled frustration, and announced that the investigation would continue into the evening. The guests murmured, their patience thinning, but Miss Marple's focus remained on the suspects. Bryce's gaze lingered on the king, a shadow of guilt or loyalty in his eyes. Eleanor's hand brushed her sapphire pendant, a gesture Miss Marple now recognized as a tell, a sign of calculation. Dubois excused himself from his conversation, slipping toward a side door, only to be stopped by a guard, his smile never faltering. Thomas dropped a goblet, the clatter drawing every eye, his stammered apology barely audible. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the medallion's theft in light of her observations. The crypt's secrets, as Dr. Mortimer had described, made the medallion a prize for those seeking power, not just wealth. Bryce's debts might tempt him to pawn it, but his loyalty suggested otherwise. Eleanor's political maneuvers could benefit from the chaos of a scandal, yet her poise spoke of subtler methods. Dubois' curiosity hinted at espionage, but his caution suggested he was more observer than actor. Thomas, with his crushing debts, was the most likely to act in desperation, yet his fear seemed to lack the cunning needed for such a theft. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Tea Party, where a stolen ring had revealed a servant's desperation, but also a mastermind's manipulation, the true thief using the servant as a shield. Could there be a similar game here, one suspect steering suspicion toward another? The possibility lingered, but Miss Marple knew. Evidence, not speculation, would light the way. Patience, she thought, is the key to a puzzle. The pieces fall into place when one watches long enough. Sir Reginald approached her bench, his steps heavy, his expression weary. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "you've been watching like a hawk. Any insights?" His tone held a grudging respect, as if he knew her quiet presence belied a formidable mind. She smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Oh, I'm just an old woman, Sir Reginald, noticing little things," she said softly. "But people reveal so much when they think no one's looking, don't you find? The way they move, the way they pause. It's like reading a book, if one knows the language." Sir Reginald's brow furrowed, but he nodded, her words a spark in his tired thoughts. As he moved off, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the hall, her needles clicking like a metronome. The suspects were threads in a tapestry, their actions weaving a story of motive and opportunity. The medallion's theft was a bold act, but its meaning lay in the quiet moments she had observed, the glances, the flinches, the unspoken fears. The truth, she thought, is a shy creature, but it always shows itself to those who wait. She settled back, her eyes scanning the crowd, content to let the drama unfold, knowing the next clue was never far away. Chapter 10. The Trap is Set. The grand hall of Eldridge Palace, though still cloaked in its regal splendor, had grown stifling as the day waned, the air thick with the weight of suspicion and confinement. The chandeliers cast long shadows, their light dimmed by the late afternoon sun filtering through the high windows, and the velvet drapes seemed to absorb the murmurs of the restless guests. The empty pedestal, its velvet cushion a mute accusation, stood at the heart of the hall, a constant reminder of the royal medallion's theft. Miss Jane Marple sat on her bench by the window, her knitting a soft cascade of clicks, her pale blue eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity that belied her unassuming demeanor. The suspects, Captain Bryce, Lady Eleanor St. Clair, Monsieur Henri Dubois, and Thomas Wren, moved within the confined space, each a player in a drama where every gesture held meaning. Miss Marple's mind was a loom, weaving the threads of her observations into a pattern that was nearing completion. The medallion's role as a key to the royal crypt, as revealed by Dr. Mortimer, had shifted the motives from greed to power, and her quiet wanderings through the palace corridors had uncovered whispers of secrets. Bryce's argument with the pawnbroker Grimsby, Eleanor's clandestine meetings, Dubois's probing questions about security, and Thomas's desperate rendezvous in the village. Each suspect carried a burden, but it was their behavior in the hall, Bryce's guarded vigilance, Eleanor's calculated poise, Dubois's restless charm, and Thomas's raw fear, that spoke loudest. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead case, where a stolen silver tray had been recovered not by accusations, but by a carefully laid trap, the thief betraying themselves through a single unguarded act. The guilty, she thought, cannot resist the bait of their own fears. With this in mind, Miss Marple sought out Sir Reginald Holt, finding him near the dais, his angular face etched with frustration as he conferred with a guard. She approached with her usual modesty, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her knitting tucked under her arm. "Sir Reginald?" she said softly, her voice barely rising above the hall's murmurs. "Might I suggest a small stratagem? In my village, we once recovered a lost brooch by announcing it had been found, prompting the thief to reveal themselves through their reaction. Perhaps we could try something similar with the medallion." Sir Reginald's brow furrowed, his skepticism clear, but her reputation for insight gave him pause. "What do you propose?" he asked, his tone grudging but curious. Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with a warm smile. "Announce that a duplicate medallion has been found in the palace vaults, to be displayed tomorrow morning. The true thief, I suspect, will not rest easy at such news. They may act, perhaps to check their hiding place, or to shift blame. We need only watch closely." Sir Reginald considered her words, his fingers tapping the hilt of his ceremonial dagger. "A bold move," he said finally. "If it fails, we risk looking foolish." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "But if it succeeds, Sir Reginald, we may catch our thief. People, you see, are rarely as clever as they think when fear takes hold." Reluctantly, he agreed, issuing orders to prepare the announcement. As evening fell, Sir Reginald took the dais, his voice cutting through the hall's tension like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "I have news. A duplicate of the royal medallion has been found in the palace vaults, secured there years ago as a precaution. It will be displayed tomorrow to restore the ceremony's honor." The guests stirred, their whispers rising like a tide, and Miss Marple's eyes darted to the suspects, her needles still but her senses sharp. Captain Bryce's face remained impassive, though his hand tightened briefly on his sword hilt, a gesture of control rather than alarm. Lady Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her sapphire pendant gleaming as she tilted her head, her expression one of calculated interest. Monsieur Dubois excused himself from a conversation, his smile fixed, but his gaze flicking toward the servants' passage. Thomas Wren, standing near a side table, spilled a goblet of wine, his hands shaking as he fumbled to clean it, his face ashen. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. The announcement had cast a stone into the pond of suspicion, and the ripples were revealing. Bryce's restraint suggested loyalty, or perhaps a man confident in his innocence. Eleanor's sharp gaze hinted at a mind assessing new risks, her ambition stirred by the news. Dubois' sudden movement was subtle, but it spoke of unease, as if the duplicate threatened some hidden plan. Thomas's panic, however, was raw, his clumsiness a beacon of fear. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead thief, a young clerk who had betrayed himself by rushing to check a hidden cache when rumors of its discovery spread. Fear, she mused, is a poor keeper of secrets. Determined to press the advantage, Miss Marple slipped from the hall, her steps light as she followed the servants' passage, a narrow corridor lined with plain stone and flickering sconces. She had overheard the maids' gossip about Thomas's late-night meeting with Grimsby, and she suspected he might act now, driven by the announcement's pressure. Near the servants' quarters, she paused in the shadow of a doorway, her knitting a pretext as she listened. Voices drifted from a small alcove, low and urgent. It was Thomas speaking to another servant, his words tumbling out in a frantic whisper. "I have to settle it with Grimsby tonight," he said, his voice trembling. "If they've found a duplicate, I'm done for. He'll know I couldn't pay." The other servant, a girl with a sharp tone, urged him to stay put, but Thomas's footsteps echoed as he slipped away toward the palace's rear exit. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. Thomas's words confirmed his desperation, but was it the desperation of a thief or of a boy trapped by circumstance? She recalled a saint. Mary Mead case, where a panicked youth had confessed to a theft he hadn't committed, his fear of a creditor's wrath outweighing his innocence. Desperation, she thought, clouds the mind, but it also reveals the heart. She made her way back to the hall, her steps unhurried, her mind turning over the trap's first fruits. Thomas's reaction was the strongest, but the others' subtle shifts, Bryce's restraint, Eleanor's calculation, Dubois' restlessness, could not be ignored. In the hall, she resumed her seat, her eyes scanning the suspects anew. Bryce had moved to a corner, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if wrestling with a silent decision. Eleanor whispered to a courtier, her words inaudible, but her posture alert, her pendant catching the light like a signal. Dubois had returned, his smile brighter than ever, but his fingers tapped restlessly against his glass. Thomas, back at his post, polished a tray with feverish intensity, his eyes darting to the exits. The trap had stirred them all, and Miss Marple knew the next hours would be critical. The guilty, she thought, will move before dawn, and the innocent will betray their fears. Sir Reginald approached, his face a mix of skepticism and hope. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "your trap has them buzzing. Seen anything worth noting?" She smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Oh, just the little things, Sir Reginald," she said softly. "People are so revealing when they think they're safe. I'd keep an eye on young Thomas tonight. He seems most unsettled." Sir Reginald nodded, his expression thoughtful, and moved off to instruct the guards. Miss Marple settled back, her needles clicking like a metronome, her mind a web of connections. The trap was set, and the suspects were caught in its threads, their reactions weaving a story of motive and fear. The medallion's theft was a puzzle, and the duplicate's announcement was a light cast into its shadows. "The truth," she thought, "is like a moth. It flutters toward the light if one is patient." She watched the hall, her eyes sharp, knowing the night would bring the next piece of the puzzle, as it always did. Chapter 11. The Revelation. The grand hall of Eldridge Palace, bathed in the pale light of early dawn, seemed to hold its breath as the guests gathered once more. The chandeliers, now barely flickering, cast long, wavering shadows across the marble floor, and the velvet drapes hung heavy, as if weary from the night's tension. The empty pedestal, its velvet cushion stark and accusing, stood at the center, a silent challenge to the assembled crowd. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her bench by the window, her knitting neatly folded in her lap, observed the scene with a calm that belied the sharpness of her gaze. Her pale blue eyes, gentle yet piercing, traced the movements of the suspects: Captain Roland Bryce, Lady Eleanor St. Clair, Monsieur Henri Dubois, and Thomas Wren, each a thread in the tapestry she had been weaving since the medallion's theft. The announcement of a duplicate medallion, her carefully laid trap, had stirred reactions, and now, as the moment of revelation approached, she felt the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Sir Reginald Holt stood on the dais, his angular frame rigid with authority, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. The guests, their faces etched with fatigue and unease, murmured softly, their anticipation palpable. Miss Marple had shared her suspicions with Sir Reginald in the pre-dawn hours, her quiet voice outlining a theory built on observation and intuition. He had listened, skeptical but intrigued, and agreed to let her address the suspects before the supposed duplicate was displayed. Now, as the hall quieted, he nodded to her, a gesture that carried the weight of reluctant trust. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "you have something to say. The floor is yours." Miss Marple rose, her small figure unassuming against the grandeur of the hall, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. She stepped forward, her steps light but purposeful, and faced the suspects, who stood in a loose semicircle near the pedestal. Bryce's face was impassive, his hands clasped behind his back, though his gray eyes flickered with tension. Eleanor's posture was regal, her emerald gown immaculate, but her fingers brushed her sapphire pendant, a tell Miss Marple had come to recognize. Dubois leaned casually against a pillar, his smile fixed, but his gaze restless. Thomas Wren, pale and trembling, clutched a tray as if it were a lifeline, his eyes darting to the exits. The crowd watched, curious and wary, as Miss Marple began to speak, her voice soft but clear, like a stream cutting through stone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that softened her words, "a theft such as this is a puzzle, not unlike those I've seen in my little village of St. Mary Mead. It's the small things, the glance, the pause, the gesture, that tell the story. The royal medallion, as Dr. Mortimer kindly explained, is more than gold and emeralds. It's a key to the royal crypt, a symbol of power. Its theft was no simple act of greed, but one born of need. And it's in that need we find our answer. She turned to Captain Bryce, her gaze steady but kind. You, Captain, were closest to the medallion, your duty to guard it unquestioned. Whispers of debts to Mr. Grimsby. The pawnbroker suggested a motive, and your hesitation when questioned hinted at a secret. But I've seen men like you in my village, loyal, proud, burdened by troubles, but bound by honor. Your secret, I think, was not theft, but a fear of disgrace, perhaps a loan taken to help a struggling family member. Your restraint last night, when the duplicate was announced, spoke of a man confident in his innocence, not one hiding guilt. Bryce's jaw tightened, but he met her gaze, a faint nod acknowledging her insight. Miss Marple thought of a saint. Mary Mead, constable, whose loyalty had kept him silent about a friend's misdeed, his honor a shield against suspicion. She turned to Lady Eleanor, her smile unwavering. Your ambition, Lady Eleanor, is no secret. Whispers of late-night meetings in the West Wing suggest a desire to shift the court's balance, perhaps to weaken the king's advisors. The medallion's loss could spark such a scandal, but your poise, your calculated words, suggest a subtler mind. Your sharp accusation of Captain Bryce, your narrowed eyes at the duplicate's announcement, they speak of a woman assessing risks, not covering a crime. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a lady much like you, whose ambitions led to whispers, but not theft. Your pendant, touched so often, is your anchor, not your guilt. Eleanor's lips parted, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before her composure returned, her hand stilling on the sapphire. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Monsieur Dubois, her tone gentle but probing. You, monsieur, are a man of charm. Your questions about palace security noted by the footman Jem. Your vagueness in questioning, your restless glance at the exits when the duplicate was announced, suggested curiosity, perhaps espionage. But in my village, I've seen men like you, observers, not actors, whose charm hides inquiry, not theft. Your accusation of Thomas was quick, but it was a deflection, not a confession. You watch, you wait, but I think the medallion was not your prize. Dubois's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing, but he inclined his head as if conceding a point in a game. Finally, she turned to Thomas Wren, whose trembling hands nearly dropped his tray, his face ashen. "Dear Thomas," she said, her voice softening, "your fear has been plain from the start. Your debts to Mr. Grimsby, your late-night meeting in the village, your panic at the duplicate's announcement, they paint a picture of desperation. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a boy like you, driven to steal to save his family, his heart good, but his choices poor. You were near the pedestal, your tray a perfect cover to slip the medallion into your apron during the ceremony's chaos. Last night, when you spoke of settling with Grimsby, your fear betrayed you. The medallion, so easily pawned, was your way out, wasn't it?" Thomas's tray clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the silent hall. His knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean harm," he sobbed. "My sister, she's dying, and Grimsby threatened the magistrate if I didn't pay. I thought I'd pawn it, get it back later. I swear I'd have returned it." His confession spilled out, raw and unpolished, and the crowd gasped, their whispers rising like a tide. Sir Reginald stepped forward, his face grim, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice gentle. "He's young, Sir Reginald, and desperate. Mercy, I think, would serve justice here." The hall fell silent, the weight of Thomas's words settling over the crowd. Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes crinkling with quiet satisfaction. She had seen the truth in the small things, Thomas's trembling hands, his panicked reaction, the maid's gossip of his meeting with Grimsby. The other suspects, though burdened by their own secrets, had not carried the mark of guilt. Bryce's loyalty, Eleanor's ambition, Dubois' curiosity, they were threads in the tapestry, but Thomas's desperation was the knot that tied it together. Sir Reginald ordered the guards to escort Thomas to a holding room, his voice stern but tempered by Miss Marple's plea. The medallion, Thomas revealed, was hidden in his quarters, wrapped in a cloth, intended for Grimsby that very night. As the crowd dispersed, their murmurs a mix of shock and relief, Miss Marple returned to her bench, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The truth, she thought, is always there, in the small things, waiting for someone to notice. Sir Reginald approached, his expression a blend of respect and astonishment. "You've done it, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "How did you know?" She smiled, her eyes warm. "Oh, Sir Reginald, people are much the same everywhere, whether in a palace or a village. It's the heart's weaknesses that give them away." He nodded, a rare smile breaking through, and moved off to oversee the medallion's recovery. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the pedestal, soon to hold its treasure again. The puzzle was solved, but the human stories, Bryce's loyalty, Eleanor's ambition, Dubois' curiosity, Thomas's desperation, remained as complex and enduring as the palace itself. "It's always the small things," she thought, "that tell the greatest truths." Chapter 12. The Quiet Departure. The grand hall of Eldridge Palace, now bathed in the soft glow of late morning, seemed to exhale as the tension of the past days began to dissipate. The chandeliers sparkled with renewed vigor, their light dancing across the polished marble floor, and the velvet drapes, once heavy with suspicion, stirred gently in a breeze from an open window. The royal medallion, recovered from Thomas Wren's quarters, where it had been hidden in a folded cloth, was returned to its pedestal, its gold emeralds gleaming as if untouched by the scandal. The guests, no longer confined, moved with a cautious relief, their murmurs a blend of awe and gossip as they recounted Miss Jane Marple's quiet unraveling of the mystery. The pedestal, once a symbol of loss, now stood as a testament to resolution, its velvet cushion cradling the relic with renewed dignity. Miss Marple sat on her bench by the window, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, her pale blue eyes resting on the medallion with a quiet satisfaction. The hall was abuzz with activity, guards resuming their posts, servants clearing the remnants of breakfast, nobles exchanging hushed theories. But she remained apart, her presence as unassuming as ever. Her nephew, Raymond West, had arrived to escort her back to St. Mary Mead, his face a mix of pride and astonishment as he approached. "Aunt Jane," he said, his voice warm with admiration, "you've outdone yourself. The whole palace is talking about how you caught the thief. How do you do it?" She smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Oh, Raymond, it's only a matter of watching people, you know. They're much the same everywhere, whether in a palace or our little village." Her thoughts drifted to the suspects, each now free of the shadow of suspicion, but marked by their own truths. Captain Roland Bryce stood near the dais, his posture erect, his gray eyes softened by relief. The whispers of his debts to the pawnbroker Grimsby, as Miss Marple had surmised, stemmed from a loan to aid a struggling sister, not a motive for theft. His loyalty had held firm, and Sir Reginald had quietly assured him of the crown's gratitude, a gesture that restored his honor. Miss Marple thought of a saint, Mary Mead Blacksmith, whose quiet sacrifices for his family had gone unnoticed until a crisis revealed his steadfast heart. Loyalty, she mused, is a heavy crown, but it fits some well. Lady Eleanor Streetclare, her emerald gown catching the light, conversed with a courtier, her laughter bright but her eyes wary. Her ambition, hinted at in the maid's gossip of clandestine meetings, remained a force, but Miss Marple's revelation had spared her the stain of suspicion. The sapphire pendant at her throat gleamed as she spoke, a reminder of her calculated poise, but also of her restraint. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead matron, whose drive for influence had stirred trouble, but never crossed into crime. Ambition, she thought, is a fire that warms or burns, depending on the hand that tends it. Monsieur Henri Dubois, leaning against a pillar, flashed his polished smile at a passing guest, his charm undimmed. The footman's report of his questions about palace security had suggested espionage, but Miss Marple suspected he was merely a curious observer, his diplomatic role a lens for watching, not acting. His restless glance at the exits during the trap had been a sign of caution, not guilt. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, journalist, whose probing questions had unsettled the village but led to no crime. Curiosity, she reflected, is a spark that lights truths or starts fires. Thomas Wren, now in custody, awaited a hearing, but Miss Marple's plea for mercy had softened Sir Reginald's judgment. The medallion, recovered from Grimsby's shop before it could be pawned, bore no mark of its brief absence, and Thomas's tearful confession had revealed a boy driven by love for his sick sister, not greed. Miss Marple had spoken quietly to Sir Reginald, suggesting a lighter sentence, perhaps service to the crown to repay his debt. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead lad, whose theft of a neighbor's tools had led to reform, not ruin, when mercy tempered justice. Desperation, she thought, is a storm that passes if given a chance. As Raymond helped her gather her things, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the hall, its grandeur now tempered by the human stories it had revealed. The medallion's theft had been a puzzle, solved not by grand gestures, but by the small things, the tremble of a hand, the flicker of a glance, the whisper of a servant. She thought of Saint Mary Mead, where every mystery, from a stolen brooch to a missing key, had taught her the same lesson. The truth lies in the heart's weaknesses, and it always surfaces for those who watch. Sir Reginald approached, his stern face softened by a rare smile. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low with respect, "the king himself sends his thanks. You've done the crown a great service." She smiled, her eyes warm. "Oh, Sir Reginald, I only listened as I always do. People tell their own stories, if one is patient." He nodded, a spark of admiration in his eyes, and turned to oversee the hall's restoration. Miss Marple took Raymond's arm, her steps light as they moved toward the palace doors. The train to St. Mary Mead awaited, promising the quiet of her cottage, her garden, and the familiar rhythms of village life. But she knew, as she always did, that mysteries would find her again, whether in a palace or a parish. People, she thought, are the same everywhere, and their secrets are never far behind. As they stepped into the courtyard, the morning air crisp and bright, Raymond chuckled. "You'll have the village buzzing with this tale, Aunt Jane." She smiled, her knitting tucked under her arm, her mind already turning to the next puzzle. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but it's the small things, Raymond, that make the greatest stories." With that, she boarded the carriage, her eyes bright with the promise of quieter days, until the next mystery called.